Hey friends, tonight we're stepping into the cobbled, smoke-filled streets of a feudal city. Not to admire the cathedrals or noble courts, but to understand something far more human: survival. A single year in this world meant dodging hunger, illness, fire, taxes, and worse. And yet somehow people endured. So before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the kind of history that lingers. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far this little community reaches. Now dim the lights, get cozy, and let's slip into a year you wouldn't wish on anyone. The constant vigil over water that could turn deadly overnight. Imagine yourself waking in a medieval town just before dawn. The streets are narrow and dark. Smoke hangs faintly in the cold air. Somewhere, a rooster calls, and just a few paces from your doorway, a figure is already moving, quietly, purposefully, toward the town's central well. She carries a wooden bucket in one hand, in the other, a long ladle. She does not speak. She leans over the stone rim, listens, and lowers the rope carefully into the water below. But before anyone drinks, she tastes it. Just one sip. Pauses. Waits. Only then do the neighbors begin to gather. In many medieval towns, water was not simply a necessity. It was a source of constant, low-level fear. Especially in dense urban areas, wells were the lifeline of a neighborhood, and also its most vulnerable point. When water ran clear and clean, life flowed with it. But if something changed, if the taste soured, if the smell shifted, if the color darkened, it could signal danger. Silent, invisible, and already too late. And so, a quiet ritual emerged: the vigil over water. Urban wells were often communal, located in central squares, courtyards, or just beyond the back doors of cluster homes. They were essential for cooking, washing, brewing, and of course drinking. But they were also open, exposed to weather, animals, and people. And in towns where walls enclosed streets and waste ran freely in alleys, contamination was never far away. To guard against it, many communities took the matter into their own hands. Chronicles from as early as the 12th century describe neighbors forming rotating watches. Not for fire, nor invaders, but for the well. Each night, someone stayed awake, often an older woman or younger servant, to ensure that nothing and no one interfered with the water. Sabotage was a quiet fear, especially during times of plague or unrest. Accusations of well poisoning surfaced quickly. In Strasbourg, in Basel, in smaller English villages with no names left on maps. Records show fines and even executions tied to the claim that someone had fouled the well. Whether true or not, the anxiety remained. More often, the threats were mundane, yet no less deadly. A stray animal could fall in and drown before anyone noticed. A cracked stone lining could allow sewage to seep in during heavy rain. Rotting leaves, mold, dead birds. Any could alter the quality of the water. And without scientific knowledge of germs or bacteria, people turned to the senses they trusted: taste, smell, clarity, and pattern. A slight bitterness might mean nothing, or the start of fever. A shimmer on the surface might be oil, or simply morning light. But many families assign someone to taste the water each morning. Just a sip, not for hydration, but for warning. In wealthier homes, servants perform the task. In humbler ones, it might be a grandmother, someone who, as one chronicler wrote, had lived long enough to know the water's true face. There are references in town rolls from York, Siena, and Bruges noting first tasters or well-testers. Informal roles never granted official titles, but understood as essential. Occasionally, these people were consulted when someone fell ill. Had the water changed? Had it turned? In some places, a drop of vinegar was added to the bucket as ritual. In others, a bit of silver was lowered, under the belief that silver would tarnish in poisoned water. There were chants, too. protective blessings murmured before the first draw of the day. Not always in Latin, sometimes just local rhyme. Something whispered to keep the darkness at bay. Because when water turned bad, it gave no warning. One day the family drank. The next day, one of them didn't rise. Then another, and by then, it was already too late. Records from London in the late 14th century describe whole alleys falling ill within days. One physician, writing decades later, suspected a rat drowned in a nearby well. Another blamed bad air in the stones. But by then, no one could know for certain. The well was sealed, the stones scrubbed, and life resumed. Some wells earned reputations for purity. These were fiercely protected. Wooden lids were fitted with locks. Keys were held by a council of elders or a trusted family. Woe to the visitor who lifted the cover without permission. Not for superstition, but for safety. The well was the shared lung of the neighborhood. Any disturbance could choke the whole body. During festivals or market days, temporary guards might be posted near urban wells, not to control the crowd, but to watch the water. Strangers, unfamiliar livestock, drunken revelers, any might endanger it. Some towns even passed laws forbidding public urination or waste disposal within a set distance of the well. Enforcement varied, but the intent remained: protect the source. In the winter, the fear quieted slightly. Cold slowed decay. But in spring and summer, when warmth returned and rain softened the ground, the vigilance grew sharper. Fresh illness, sour smells, sudden deaths. These were taken seriously. And always, the well was the first suspect. It's easy now, with tap water and treatment plants, to forget what it meant to drink with hesitation, to pause before lifting a cup, to taste not for pleasure, but for peril. But for centuries, water was never simply taken. It was earned, watched, tasted with care. And when it was lost, when a well had to be closed, it was like losing a limb. People mourned it. Candles were sometimes lit. In a few places, small stones were dropped in with prayers. Not as burial, but as apology. You can still see some of those wells in older European towns. Bricked over, covered in ivy. Quiet remnants of an age when life flowed uncertain from the dark mouth of the earth. And when one mouthful could mean health or sorrow. They are rarely noticed now, passed by on walking tours, labeled on plaques. But if you stop and listen, you might hear the echo of buckets, the creak of a rope, the soft splash of water returning. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you might still wonder, would you taste it first? Would you be the watcher? And how would you know if the water had turned overnight? Because once it did not turn back. The ritual of scrubbing thresholds to keep plague at bay. Imagine yourself standing in a narrow, cobbled alley just before dawn. The sky is still gray, the stones underfoot cool with night's breath, and the world feels suspended, caught in that gentle silence before the street awakens. There is no sound but the soft swish of cloth, and the muted slosh of liquid being poured from a clay jug. A woman kneels at a doorway. Her apron is tied tight. In her hands, a bundle of rags soaked in vinegar and rosemary. She dips the cloth again and again, then scrubs the worn threshold stone with a slow, rhythmic motion. It's not done in haste, not even for cleanliness, exactly. It is a ritual, a quiet gesture of hope, for in the time of plague, when illness moved like smoke through cities and death knocked without warning, this simple act became something sacred. Across Europe, from the crooked alleys of London to the canals of Venice, from the low-slung cottages of Yorkshire to the tight courtyards of Marseille, families took to scrubbing the stones at their door. Not just for hygiene, though the practice did help, but because many believed that the very entrance to the home, the threshold, was the first point of defense against sickness. And more than that, it was where spirits passed, where fate entered, where disease, if not stopped, might drift in quietly and make a bed of your children. So they scrubbed, usually with a mixture of vinegar and herbs, thyme, rosemary, lavender, sage, or marjoram, whatever could be grown or traded. These ingredients were not random. Many were chosen for their sharp, cleansing scent. Others were believed to possess protective qualities. Some, like vinegar, had mild antiseptic properties, though this was not understood in modern terms at the time. Instead, it was understood through symbolism. Vinegar cut the air. Herbs calmed it. The threshold, cleaned thoroughly, became not just a border of stone, but a kind of seal. In wealthier homes, servants often carried out the task, working their way along front steps, scrubbing until the stone glistened. In poorer neighborhoods, it was often the elder of the household or the mother who took up the duty. Some did it daily, others on Fridays, when the week turned, many more during outbreaks, when bells rang heavy in the air and carts moved slowly down the lanes. They said the plague could not cross a clean stone. There is no scientific truth in that, but there is human truth. These threshold rituals are mentioned in a handful of household account books, especially during the outbreaks of the 14th and 17th centuries. In one London record from 1603, a line of expenditure reads, "To vinegar, herbs, and cloth for scrubbing the stoop, 6d weekly." In a French letter from 1720, a merchant writes that his wife will not let their son pass through the front door until the stone has been cleansed, as is wise. And then there are the quiet stories, the oral ones, preserved not in ink, but in practice. A neighbor who never missed her weekly scrubbing and never lost a child. A narrow house where every other door on the lane was marked with chalk for the dead, except the one where the stone was always wet, always glistening with herb water. These were not facts, but they became memory, and memory, in times of grief, shapes behavior. Some households added a prayer, a line muttered each time the cloth passed over the threshold. Others left a sprig of dried herb tucked into a crack in the stone, or sprinkled salt into the corners after cleaning. These small acts layered upon one another, half faith, half habit, until the ritual became automatic. Comforting. It gave control where there was none. That's what historians often miss when reading accounts of plague years. Not just the suffering, but the rituals of survival, the little patterns that gave meaning to an otherwise chaotic and terrifying time. Washing a threshold might not have cured disease, but it made people feel that they were doing something, anything, to keep the sickness away. There were variations. In Venice, some families washed their doors with seawater mixed with lemon peel. In the Scottish Highlands, broom branches were dipped in vinegar and swept across the entry 3 times, always before sunrise. In parts of Eastern Europe, garlic cloves were rubbed into the wood and left to rot there, repelling both spirits and pests, they said. Interestingly, these rituals were rarely recorded by official chroniclers. The men who wrote of plague often focused on numbers, edicts, mass burials, and quarantine laws. But in the spaces between those records, you find the traces, literally, of human hands. The smoothness of worn threshold stones. The faint residue of oil and herb in long-abandoned doorways. In some old towns, if you look closely, you might still see it. A darker band at the base of a door. Not from weathering alone, but from generations of ritual contact. Generations of hope. There are few grand monuments to the plague survivors, but there are these stones, these quiet thresholds that bore the hands of the living, again and again, against a fear they could not name but felt approaching, like cold wind around a corner. And perhaps, in their own way, they worked. Because hope has power. Routine has power. And even if vinegar and herbs could not halt the plague entirely, the ritual kept something else at bay: despair. So picture that alley again. The woman kneeling. The slow circle of cloth. The scent of rosemary and something sour in the air. A child watches from behind the doorway, learning not just how to clean, but how to protect, how to hope, how to carry forward a ritual when everything else has fallen apart. And the street is quiet again, just for a moment, and the stone glistens. The bread tokens that determined who would eat or go hungry. Imagine yourself inside a narrow, dimly lit home on the edge of a medieval town. The fire in the hearth has long gone cold. A single shelf holds a worn bowl, a wooden spoon, and a small cloth-wrapped bundle tucked carefully behind a beam. If you were to unwrap that cloth, you'd find not coins, not jewels, but a handful of simple clay discs, each pressed with a symbol. Small, almost unremarkable, and yet, these are tokens that might mean the difference between a full belly and going to bed with only hunger. In times of scarcity, when poor harvests, war, or disease disrupted grain supplies, bread became more than food. It became control. Town councils, parishes, and bakers' guilds faced the impossible task of rationing nourishment in a world where supply was fragile and famine could arrive without warning. One response, both practical and quietly profound, was the bread token. These tokens were often made of clay, though some were wood or lead. They were roughly the size of a coin, sometimes square, sometimes round, with a simple imprint, an emblem of the issuing authority, a baker's mark, or a date. Unlike money, these had no value outside their context. You couldn't buy cloth or candles with them, but with the right stamp at the right oven, they could be exchanged for a loaf of bread. Not more, not less. They appear in scattered records beginning in the 14th century and continuing in various forms well into the 17th. Most often they were used during food crises, when it was no longer safe or fair to let the market decide who could eat. Bakers were given a limited supply of flour, and families were issued tokens, one per person, one per day, or according to another rationing logic set by the local authorities. The logic was cold but clear. If everyone could receive bread, everyone needed a token. No token, no loaf. The tokens themselves were not issued lightly. Some were distributed by churches, others by town magistrates. In some villages, it was the baker who held the list, marking off names, counting tokens, deciding who had already received their share. And while the system brought order to chaos, it also introduced a quiet kind of fear, not of violence or theft, but of loss. Because a lost token meant more than inconvenience. It meant hunger. Chroniclers noted how fiercely families guarded them. One Flemish writer in the early 1400s described households building niches in their walls, small, hollowed-out spaces behind loose stones or chimney bricks, where tokens could be hidden, not for secrecy, but for safety. Children were taught never to touch them. Visitors were never shown where they were stored. And in some cases, tokens were passed from one generation to another, not for reuse, but as relics of a time when bread itself had to be earned in silence. In more than one account, people carved personal symbols into the tokens they received. An extra mark, a notch, a tiny scratch, just in case someone tried to swap them. A token might look identical on the outside, but a mother would know if it wasn't hers. She had memorized every chip along the edge, every curve of the stamp. And sometimes she had dreamt of it, lying awake at night, worrying whether it was still safely hidden behind the wall. The tokens were not without controversy. There were accusations, some probably true, of favoritism, of forged tokens passed in secret, of flour stretched too far, of bakers shorting loaves or refusing those they didn't trust. But despite its flaws, the system endured because it created a framework, one that allowed order to be maintained when hunger might otherwise tear it apart. In a few towns, tokens were ceremonially destroyed once the crisis ended, gathered in piles and smashed or burned, as if to purge the memory of famine. But in others they lingered. People kept them in drawers, in prayer books, even sewn into hems, not because they thought they'd be needed again, but because they had once represented survival in some archaeological digs, particularly in rural areas of England, France, and the Low Countries. These small stamped discs have turned up in the walls of cottages, inside hearthstones, or buried beneath thresholds, often mistaken for game pieces or discarded seals. Only when viewed in context do they speak of their original purpose. And what they tell us is not just about food, it's about quiet resilience. These tokens were more than rations. They were promises, a fragile pact between authority and the ordinary people whose lives depended on things far beyond their control. Rain, soil, insects, politics. When those systems failed, the tokens held a place in the middle, a small, tangible anchor of fairness, however imperfect. And they left their mark in the rhythm of daily life. A child sent to the baker's door clutching a single clay disc, the careful checkmark on a list, the short nod from the baker's assistant, the warm, heavy loaf placed in tired hands. Then the walk home, quiet, purposeful, holding not just bread, but the memory of how close the line had come. So tonight, if your thoughts wander to old kitchens and crumbling hearths, imagine that little bundle tucked into the corner of a home. A cloth wrapping something simple, clay, pressed with a mark, and the knowledge that once survival came down to something so small, it could be hidden behind a stone, but carried the weight of an entire meal. Because in that world, the difference between hunger and hope might be no more than a disk of earth, and the promise that tomorrow's loaf would still be waiting. The quiet inspections that could end a merchant's trade. Imagine yourself standing in a cramped medieval workshop, low-ceilinged, warm with the scent of oil, beeswax, and iron. The windows are narrow slits, letting in just enough light to show the polished scale on the workbench, its tiny brass pans gleaming dully. On the shelf above, bundles of dyed cloth, sealed jars of spices, or coils of wire wait in quiet order, labeled in a careful, practiced hand. And then the knock comes. Not a loud bang, not the dramatic entrance of a guard, just a single, measured rap. Perhaps not even a knock at all. Only the creak of the door's iron hinge as it opens, unannounced. The inspector has arrived. In medieval towns and cities, this was not uncommon. Across much of Europe from the 12th through 16th centuries, guilds and municipalities developed elaborate systems of trade regulation. Markets depended on trust between buyer and seller, and between sellers themselves. If that trust broke down, so did commerce. And so city officials walked quietly among the stalls, workshops, and counting rooms, watching for signs of dishonesty. They did not wear uniforms. There was no flashing badge. The most feared inspections were not loud. They were silent, efficient, and final. Each trade had its standards. A baker's loaf was expected to meet a prescribed weight. A cloth merchant's bolt must stretch the promised length. A candlemaker's wax could not be watered down with fat. The scales used by goldsmiths, apothecaries, and spice sellers were particularly scrutinized, where a single false grain could change fortunes. Inspectors often came in pairs, usually accompanied by a scribe. One would test weights and measures. The other would quietly observe the workshop's contents, the behavior of apprentices, the cleanliness of tools. The scribe would record findings, often without comment. They rarely explained themselves, and they never needed to raise their voice. For the merchant, it was a performance played without script. Every word, every gesture could influence the outcome. One misplaced explanation might be read as guilt, one awkward pause as evidence. And while the punishment for fraud varied, fines, suspension, or in serious cases, exile, the most feared outcome was simple: closure. A merchant's license, once revoked, was rarely reinstated. Even those who survived inspection could suffer. Whispers spread quickly. If a merchant's scales were found even slightly off, customers might vanish. Trust, once shaken, did not return easily. And so, as the inspectors moved through the city's markets and alleys, a subtle tension followed them. Not panic, not open resistance, just quiet dread. Merchants learned to read the inspectors' faces like scripture. A raised eyebrow, a hesitation before writing, a soft sigh. These were warnings more potent than any decree. Older shopkeepers trained their apprentices not only in their craft, but in how to stand, where to place their hands, and how to answer with honesty and clarity, especially under scrutiny. Inspections didn't always happen on a fixed schedule. In some cities, they arrived with no notice, prompted by rumor, a competitor's complaint, or an uptick in customer disputes. In others, they came on feast days or the eve of market fairs, when prices rose and temptation crept in. The element of unpredictability was key. The fear of being caught had to be stronger than the hope of cheating unnoticed. Guilds themselves sometimes conducted these inspections. They had as much to lose as the city did if one of their members was exposed. A dishonest member could tarnish the entire profession's reputation. As a result, some guild halls kept their own ledgers of infractions, private, internal records noting who was warned, who was fined, and who was quietly asked to retire. There's a surviving note from a 14th century London guild record that reads simply, "The copper weight of Master Henry did not match the guild measure. His shop is closed. His apprentice is reassigned. No further comment. No explanation. His livelihood ended in a single afternoon." Not all inspections were purely punitive. Some served as reminders, a presence meant to nudge, to ensure merchants remained attentive. A brief appearance by an inspector, even without incident, could reset the atmosphere in a market street. Prices stabilized. Scales were recalibrated. Books were double-checked by candlelight that evening. And while some tried to skirt the rules, hiding lesser-quality goods in the back, keeping 2 sets of weights, training apprentices to distract the inspectors, these tricks were often short-lived. Inspectors, drawn from the merchant class themselves, knew what to look for. A slightly loose seal, a bolt of cloth rolled too tightly, dust on the top shelf, where the cheaper spices were hidden. The pressure was not constant. There were days, even weeks, when inspectors were not seen. But their absence did not bring relief. It brought uncertainty. And for merchants, uncertainty was often worse than discipline. Because when the inspector did return, they brought not just their judgment, but the accumulated expectation of honesty. Some workshops displayed small talismans or icons near their measuring tools. Not for luck, but for focus. A carved saint beside the balance. A prayer scratched into the beam above the bench. These were not superstitions in the usual sense. They were acknowledgments that one's trade, one's survival, rested on a thin line between trust and doubt. Today, when we picture medieval markets, we often imagine color, noise, shouting. But behind that energy lay these quieter rituals of checking, measuring, confirming. The steady hands of people who knew they might be watched, and those silent figures who walked the streets not to punish, but to preserve the fragile machinery of trust. So if you ever visit a recreated medieval shop, pause for a moment. Look at the scales, the jars, the markings on the wall. Imagine a knock, a pause, a figure entering without a word, and a merchant trying very hard not to glance nervously at the beam of the scale. Because in that silence, everything could change. The constant repair of roof tiles before winter's arrival. Imagine a small medieval village, nestled in a shallow valley where smoke curls lazily from stone chimneys and the wind carries the scent of damp wood and drying herbs. It's late autumn. The leaves have already fallen, soft underfoot and darkening with moisture. The skies are heavier now, lower, grayer, and prone to long silences before the first rain arrives. In the fields, nothing new grows. And in the homes, everyone is looking upward, not toward the heavens, but toward their roofs. Because before the rains begin and the frost tightens its grip, there is a job that cannot be postponed. The roof, thatch, tile, or rough slate must be checked. And if even a single piece is loose, broken, or gone altogether, the result could be far worse than a damp night. It could mean the loss of an entire winter's worth of dried beans, or stored oats, or the precious grain sack hidden in the attic corner. Across much of medieval Europe, roof repair was not a task for professionals, at least not in ordinary households. It was a collective duty, something passed down like a family recipe. Fathers showed sons how to test the beam underfoot. Mothers handed up bundles of straw to patch soft spots in the thatch. Neighbors traded tools, shared ladders, and pointed out slipping tiles like they were gossip. And in many places, it became a kind of ritual, an early signal that the year's harvest season had truly come to an end. In towns where tile roofs were common, such as parts of southern France or the Low Countries, maintenance was quiet but constant. Medieval chronicles mention the dull, rhythmic clack of terracotta being lifted and reset. Often it was done in the cool hours just after sunrise, while the dew still clung to mossy eaves and chickens scratched below for stray grains. You might hear a few words between workers, but mostly there was silence. This was not noisy labor, but watchful labor, carefully balancing between damage prevention and the constraints of time and light. Roofing materials varied widely by region. In England and parts of Germany, thick bundles of thatch, tied reeds or straw, were laid tightly and overlapped to shed rain. These needed replacing or patching every few years, sometimes more often if birds had taken to nesting or if smoke from the hearth below had weakened the fibers. In Italy or Spain, baked tiles were more common, fitted in neat interlocking curves that channeled water down into gutters carved from stone or wood. And in the Highlands or wetter areas of Scotland and Wales, slate was laid heavy and flat, resilient, but prone to slipping if a frost wedged between the layers. Regardless of material, the principle remained the same. The roof had to hold, because once winter came, repair would be much harder. Ladders would freeze. Snow and ice would make surfaces treacherous. And even a small hole could let in days' worth of slow, destructive moisture. A single drip, at first a dark mark on the ceiling, might soak into straw bedding, mold bread stored in the rafters, or even weaken the wooden beams that held the structure together. For those living close to the margin, and that was most, there was little room for error. Chroniclers wrote not just of the grand events of kings and wars, but also of the steady, seasonal rhythms of daily survival. One entry from a 14th century Flemish town record notes, quite simply, that no house was untouched this year. Each man tended his roof before the November rains. Another, from rural Burgundy, describes entire families gathering for the task. Children hauling up small bundles, grandfathers pointing out which ridge line had started to sag. There was also a spiritual aspect to roof maintenance, particularly in religious communities. In certain monastic orders, the act of repairing shelter before winter was likened to preparing the soul for hardship. As the body required protection, so too did the spirit. One abbot's sermon in 1372 even compares a cracked tile to a lapse in virtue. Small, easily ignored, but eventually devastating if left alone. And while the work was practical, it was not without its quiet rituals. In parts of Eastern Europe, it was customary to place a small charm beneath the final tile. Often a sprig of rosemary, a bit of woven thread, or a coin, meant to ward off leaks and bring fortune. These weren't formal superstitions, but gentle gestures, meant to reassure in a world that offered few guarantees. Interestingly, even castles and grand estates were not immune to the need for seasonal repair. Though the materials may have been sturdier, stone shingles, lead sheets, or copper gutters, the labor was just as time-sensitive. In large households, stewards were responsible for organizing roof inspections, often in late September or early October. If they delayed too long, the consequences could be costly, not just in damage, but in reputation. A leaking guest chamber could sour alliances more quickly than a poorly cooked dinner. What's remarkable is that despite centuries of architectural change, the urgency of roof care remains surprisingly relatable. Even now, homeowners inspect shingles before a storm. We patch and prepare, not just because we fear damage, but because there's something deeply human in the act of protecting the space that shelters us. So, imagine yourself standing on a wooden ladder, leaning into the slope of your own family's roof, the cold beginning to sting your fingers. A relative passes you a bundle of thatch, or perhaps a warm tile. Below, someone tends the hearth. The air is quiet, but not still, and you know, as everyone knew, that this work, done now, might be the only thing standing between comfort and a long, slow misery. That is the rhythm they lived by. Not the ticking of clocks, but the pulse of seasons, the rise of wind, the feel of damp in the air, the slow, deliberate effort to stay one step ahead of hunger, cold, and ruin, all beneath a roof that, if repaired in time, might hold just enough. The ashes spread at dawn to mark clean thresholds. Imagine the sound of a broom on stone just before sunrise. A soft rasping, steady and slow, barely heard over the first birdsong of morning. The street is still dark. Windows are shuttered. Smoke has not yet risen from hearths. And in the dim half-light, someone steps outside. Likely a woman, apron tied, hair tucked under a cloth, and with careful strokes, sweeps a small pile of fine gray ash across the threshold of her doorway. Not to clean, exactly, but to mark. In many towns and villages throughout medieval Europe, there was a quiet ritual that took place before the day properly began. Ashes swept across a home's entrance, often in a neat line or curve, to signify something simple, but vital. That the household was clean, and more importantly, that it was safe. It's not a practice often recorded in official histories, but it appears faintly in letters, in side notes of parish records, in the memories of midwives, guildsmen, and traveling friars. A subtle code understood not by the powerful, but by neighbors, by those whose lives depended on one another's health, habits, and honesty, in a time when illness could spread quickly, and its source was rarely understood. Small signals became powerful. The ash line was one such sign. It told passers-by, "We have swept, we have scrubbed, we have burned yesterday's waste. The hearth is clean. The bedding has aired. No sickness lives here." And if no line appeared, if the doorway was untouched, it didn't mean anyone was ill. Not necessarily, but people noticed, and they passed a little farther from the door as they walked. Perhaps they didn't knock that week to borrow salt or needle. Perhaps they sent the children the long way around, just to be safe. Ash was abundant. It came from the hearth, after all, wood burned each day for heat, for food, for light. And it was clean in its own way. Dry, sterile, absorbent. Used for scouring pots, whitening linens, even in early forms of soap. Spreading it across a doorstep was simple, easy, but it carried meaning. There are scattered records from 13th century Flanders of towns recommending such markings during waves of sickness. Not plague necessarily, but fever, flux, or unknown ailments that passed from door to door. The ashes, in these cases, became both symbol and barrier, a declaration of order in a world that often felt chaotic. In some regions, the custom deepened. A curved line meant the house was clean and healthy. A straight line indicated someone inside was recovering, and that visitors should wait. In extreme cases, a complete ring of ash was made around the entrance, not for magic, but as a form of polite quarantine. No enforcement was needed. Social pressure was enough. To skip the ritual was to invite suspicion. To mark your door falsely was worse. Neighbors remembered. Midwives carried news. And while punishments were rare, isolation came quietly. Trust was the true currency of communal life. In towns where waste ran through open gutters and rooms were shared by entire families, cleanliness was not cosmetic. It was survival. And in the absence of modern hygiene, ash became a partner in prevention. Not foolproof, of course, but better than nothing. Its use was practical, too. Ash absorbed moisture at the threshold. It discouraged insects. In colder climates, it kept ice from forming. But its real power was symbolic. A visual cue, renewed each morning, that this household had done its part. That the boundary between private and public had been acknowledged and cared for. Some homes developed their own flourishes. A spiral at the center of the line. A pattern of dots made with thumb or stick. Simple marks, but meaningful, like signatures on the ground. And over time, certain families became known for their ash lines. Their steadiness. Their reliability. These homes were trusted, sought after in times of uncertainty. Children learned the task early. Ash first, a mother might say, before bread or play. And so the memory passed down. Even when the reason faded, even today, in a few remote places, the echo remains. The idea of marking a clean threshold. Not with ash, perhaps, but with swept stone or a fragrant herb laid across the sill. There is something enduring about it. The need to signal safety. To show others, without words, that you have taken care. That they may pass near your home without fear. And something also about the dawn itself. Why at that hour? Because in the soft beginning of the day, everything is quieter, more visible. The ash would lie undisturbed, a clear line in the new light. Before carts rolled by, before boots scuffed the streets, it was a fresh mark in a fresh morning. If you noticed a house without it, you might pause, perhaps offer help, or simply steer clear. And if you noticed a house where the ashes had not changed for days, it might mean something else entirely. There are quiet references in plague time letters, letters of fear and longing, mentioning ashless doors. One merchant in 1349 writes that, "The door of my cousin's house bears no mark, and I have not seen smoke from her chimney in 2 days. I fear the worst." And yet, in many neighborhoods, the simple practice endured long after the crisis passed. Not because it was necessary, but because it was part of the rhythm. Sweep the hearth. Scatter the ash. Mark the door. Greet the day. It was not religious, though some gave it sacred weight. It was not political, though it shaped relationships. It was simply understood, a language made of dust. Today, thresholds go unmarked, and danger, when it comes, is measured differently. But the impulse remains, to place something between the world and the home. A lock, a mat, a gesture, and though the ashes are long gone, their purpose lingers. Not to protect from contagion, perhaps, but to say to anyone passing, we are paying attention, we are still here. We are trying to keep each other safe. In the quiet hours of morning, when the world still holds its breath, that message needs no words. The hidden lanterns that lit the way home after curfew. Imagine a medieval city just after nightfall. The sky has darkened to the color of cold iron. Somewhere beyond the walls, wolves cry out. Within, the streets are hushed. Doors are bolted. Market stalls shuttered. A curfew bell has long since rung its final warning, and the city gates have closed for the night. But not everyone has made it home. And for those still outside, or weaving carefully through back alleys to avoid patrols, one glimmer of hope remains. A light, dim, flickering, barely visible through the slats of a shuttered window. A hidden lantern, hung just behind the wood, placed on the far edge of a sill, or suspended by wire within the folds of a private curtain. These lanterns were never meant to flood the street with light. Instead, they offered just enough glow to mark a path, a clue for the latecomer, a soft assurance that, yes, this is the corner, this is the door, you're almost there. In many walled cities across Europe, strict curfews were enforced after dark, not only to prevent crime, but to guard against fire, unrest, or outside invasion. Once the gates were shut, they remained locked until sunrise. And within, guards patrolled the lanes, armed not only with weapons, but with orders to detain anyone moving without cause. To be out past curfew was dangerous. You could be mistaken for a thief, or worse, a spy. Some guards were lenient, others were eager for confrontation. In cities under martial rule, a late-night arrest could mean imprisonment or public punishment the next morning. And yet, there were always reasons to be late. A merchant delayed outside the walls. A daughter whose labor began at twilight. A son who tarried too long in the tavern. Not everyone who broke curfew did so carelessly. Many did it out of necessity. And those inside, worried, waiting, found ways to guide them home. Thus began the quiet custom of the hidden lantern. Unlike street lanterns or public watchlights, these were personal, improvised, hung by families, lovers, or friends with no formal sanction, often in defiance of local rules. Because in most cities, it was forbidden to leave a light visible after a certain hour. Fire risk being the main concern. But sometimes, concern for a loved one eclipsed concern for a fine. The lanterns were never obvious. That would have drawn attention. Instead, a family might hang a thin cloth soaked in vinegar in front of the window, dimming the light and reducing smoke. Others placed colored glass or oiled paper behind shutters to control the flicker, letting just enough through to signal. It wasn't always meant to illuminate. It was meant to orient. Late travelers memorized routes by the glow. Turn left where the green light glows. Home is just after the flickering curtain. One man, writing from Lübeck in the 15th century, described how his brother would light a lantern behind the bread shelf, which faced the alley but looked like nothing more than kitchen warmth. But I knew the pattern of its shadow, he wrote, and it brought me in like the scent of salt. Some used rhythm. Lanterns were briefly uncovered, then covered again. 2 pulses meant the way was safe. A single flicker meant guards nearby. These quiet systems of signal and shadow grew more elaborate during times of siege or political unrest, when movement was more tightly watched and families needed to communicate without sound. There are even surviving lanterns from the period. Small, tin or brass-framed, with handles for suspension and sliding shutters to modulate the flame. Some bear soot marks from having been pressed too close to wood. Others have singe marks, evidence of years spent hidden behind boards or fabric. The practice was not without risk. If caught, those hanging such lights could be fined, or worse. Records from Bruges and Ghent mention citizens punished for unauthorized illumination. In one instance, a woman was forced to stand at the market cross wearing a black hood for hanging unlawful lanterns for her cousin's entry. She said only that she didn't want him lost. In another, a baker was ordered to remove the small oil lamp he kept lit behind a corner stone at night, though several witnesses insisted it helped guide workers returning after deliveries. Still, the lanterns appeared, night after night, quiet acts of defiance, but also of care. There was no official term for them. Some called them curfew candles, others shadow lights. In certain port cities, they were nicknamed ghost lanterns, because they seemed to appear and vanish like will-o'-the-wisps. But they were deeply human, because the practice was born not from rebellion, but from tenderness, from the ache of waiting, from the knowledge that someone was out there, trying to find their way home. And sometimes, the light wasn't for a person. In one set of household records from 1611, A woman lit a lantern behind her shutter for a month after her son was lost outside the gates. She knew he would not return, but the light, she said, was a promise kept, whether seen or not. Even now, in some older quarters of European towns, you can find the little alcoves. Stone shelves just under windows, not big enough for flower pots, but perfectly shaped for a lantern. And sometimes, rarely quietly, someone still leaves a candle there on festival nights. A tradition said to honor those who once lit the way, and those still trying to find it. We no longer lock city gates. Curfews are rare, and street lamps are many, but the feeling remains. The comfort of a small, private light. A signal meant not for the world, but for one person in particular. A way of saying, "I'm here. Come home. I'll wait, however long it takes." And so the lanterns flickered on, behind shutters, in kitchens, beneath bedsheets and over door frames. Simple flames in the dark, glowing softly against fear, against separation, against forgetting. Not because they banished danger, but because they meant someone still believed you'd return. The chimneys watched for telltale smoke of forbidden work. Imagine yourself walking through the narrow alleys of a medieval town just before sunrise. The streets are damp with dew, the rooftops close and uneven, and from dozens of crooked chimneys, the first tendrils of smoke begin to curl upward into the pale morning air. To most, it's an ordinary scene, but to those who knew how to read it, that smoke told a story, a quiet confession of what was being made behind closed doors. In towns where trades were tightly regulated, where space was limited and guilds held strict control over production, chimneys became one of the earliest forms of industrial surveillance. Not by design, but by necessity. You couldn't always see what your neighbor was doing inside, but you could smell it, and you could watch the color, density, and timing of the smoke that rose from their flue. In cities like York, Rouen, and Ghent, records from as early as the 13th century describe ordinances that restricted certain crafts to specific districts, often on the outskirts of town. These weren't arbitrary rules. Certain trades, like fulling, dyeing, tanning, and tallow rendering, produced foul fumes and dangerous runoff. The work was essential, but unwelcome. If done too close to homes, markets, or churches, it could lead to illness, complaint, or worse, suspicion of unsanctioned production. And yet, for some, the risk of operating quietly within the walls, illegally but discreetly, was worth it. The customer might be closer, the costs lower, the time more convenient. So the work continued in hidden corners, backrooms in closed courtyards, and, most revealing of all, chimneys. Inspectors, sometimes called wardens or viewers, were appointed by guilds or city councils to walk the streets, particularly in the early hours or after dusk. They watched the rooftops. They studied the smoke. A pale gray puff from a kitchen fire might be ignored, but thick, sooty plumes at odd hours, or oily threads with a green or yellow tinge. These could point to dying vats heating beyond curfew, or worse, to illicit batches of soap, candles, or black market ale. One town ordinance from 1429 in Norwich warned that those who heat the cauldron for unlawful craft shall be known by their chimney, as the air betrays them. It's a simple statement, but revealing. In a time before printed signs or enforcement patrols, it was the air, and those who noticed its changes, that became the means of regulation. Neighbors played a quiet role as well. While some communities turned a blind eye, others watched closely. A widow who suddenly had income, a clothier who worked past permitted hours, a family whose chimney smoked strangely sweet during Lent. These were things not always confronted directly, but whispered to wardens, or left in anonymous notes to the parish or council. Reports were rarely aggressive, more often couched in phrases like, "It may be worth looking into," or "The air does not smell right." Sometimes, accusations were true. Other times, they were simply convenient. a way to trouble a rival, or deflect attention from one's own misdeeds. But either way, the smoke was treated seriously. Certain smells became especially suspect. The acrid bite of fermented urine, used in fulling wool. The fatty reek of tallow melting for candles or soap. The sharp, sour tang of fermented dye solutions. These odors traveled easily, especially in tight neighborhoods where chimneys were low and close together. In a few well-documented cases, enforcement led to confiscation, not just of tools and product, but of the chimney itself. A mason would be hired to seal the flue, or to partially dismantle the upper stack, rendering the hearth useless for work. These measures were rare, but when carried out, they made a lasting example. Interestingly, not all chimney smoke was watched for punishment. In some cities, established guild members were required to produce regular, visible signs of work. A chimney that stayed cold too long might invite questions. Was the craftsman unwell, withholding production, or engaging in side trades outside guild oversight? In this sense, smoke could betray either too much activity or not enough. Household diaries and letters sometimes mention the way people monitored this, almost instinctively. The house across has not smoked since Tuesday. One woman in Bristol wrote in 1493. It is either mourning or hiding something. No further explanation was given. There's something intimate in the way smoke was read. Like breath, it rose and vanished, but left behind the memory of its scent. And just as the walls of a home could conceal secrets, the chimney often revealed them. Not directly, not openly, but through a rhythm that could be quietly observed and silently reported. In winter months, when fires were more frequent and harder to distinguish, enforcement became trickier. Some illicit traders took advantage of this, blending their forbidden work into the general fog of daily hearth smoke. Others disguised their fumes by burning sweet herbs or mixing their fuel to mask the color. But even then, the most experienced wardens claimed they could still tell. "You cannot hide purpose from fire," one wrote in a guild ledger. The chimney always knows. So tonight, if your thoughts drift to old towns and winding alleys, imagine the rooftops, low-tiled, clustered, and above them, the thin trails of smoke rising in the dawn. Some innocent, some unspoken, all watched, because in a time when work could be survival, or a crime, the chimney was more than a vent. It was a messenger, a silent witness to what was done, and what was hidden. And even now, long after the watchers are gone, those stones remember. The scent lingers faintly in forgotten chimneys. The soot carries stories no one told aloud. And somewhere, if the air is still enough, a quiet trace of forbidden labor curls upward once more. Lost in time, but not entirely unseen. The bread crusts saved to feed rats that would spare stores. Imagine yourself in the back corner of a dim, cold storeroom in a medieval tenement. The air is thick with a scent of grain, dust, and earth. Somewhere overhead, the boards creak gently as footsteps pass. A candle flickers in a low clay holder, barely illuminating the floor where sacks of barley and oats are stacked carefully, with gaps between them to discourage mold. And there, in the farthest corner, someone has scattered a few hard bread crusts dry browned, left intentionally. Not by accident, not as waste, but as an offering. In the poorest quarters of medieval towns, it was quietly believed that rats could be bargained with, that if one gave them a little, crumbs, old crusts, stale rinds, they might take mercy, they might leave the rest. The idea was not officially taught, nor formally recorded in law, but it lived in stories, in habits passed from mother to daughter, in the careful decisions made late at night when food was scarce. Rats were an ever-present fact of life. In cities without sanitation systems, with grain stored in cellars and dried fish hanging in eaves, vermin thrived. Traps existed, and so did cats, but neither could guarantee safety. Grain spoiled, Infestations came, and in households where a month's food could be lost in a single night, the presence of rats was less a nuisance than a threat. So, a quiet superstition emerged. Some called it foolishness, others swore by it. The logic was simple. Rats, like people, respond to predictability. Feed them a small corner meal, and perhaps they would return to it. Perhaps they would leave the main sacks untouched. Chronicles mention this practice in passing. A 15th century Florentine writer notes, with mild condescension, that those of meaner sorts leave bread in dark places, believing the rat respects the hand that feeds. A similar mention appears in a municipal record from Bruges, where inspectors noted that a grain cellar had corner offerings, a term they left unexplained but clearly disapproved of. This was not a widespread guild-sanctioned policy. Wealthier merchants and granary owners preferred cats, pitch-line bins, and salted perimeters. But among the lower classes, those with a single sack of flour to last the winter, feeding the rats seemed the lesser risk. It was not a reward, it was a deal. The crusts themselves were chosen deliberately. Not fresh bread. That was too valuable. But the outer edge, hardening on the table overnight, could be spared. A child might be told to leave the ends for the corners. An old woman might mutter a phrase as she scattered them. Nothing elaborate, just a whispered rhythm, a sort of apology or truce. Sometimes it seemed to work. A family might find that their stores remained untouched longer than a neighbor's. Whether this was luck, climate, or coincidence didn't matter. In the rhythm of survival, even illusions offered comfort. And so the practice endured. What's curious is how private it remained. Unlike many household customs, such as marking doors during illness or sprinkling ash for luck, this one was rarely discussed aloud. Perhaps because it sounded ridiculous to those who had not known hunger, or perhaps because it was seen as a kind of quiet pact with wildness. A recognition that the home's boundaries were never secure. In rural areas, where barns stored larger quantities of grain, similar beliefs took root. A corner of the shed might be left dusty and deliberately undisturbed. A handful of oats might be scattered just outside the threshold. Not too much. Just enough to satisfy. Just enough to suggest a line. Here is your portion, and no more. Children grew up watching their elders do it without explanation. They learned the ritual by repetition. Not as magic, not even as certainty, but as tradition. A gesture of humility before nature's persistence. In more literate circles, such habits were ridiculed. A 16th century satirical poem from the Low Countries mocks a poor baker who feeds the rat like kin and starves his dog to keep him thin. Yet even as they laughed, the better fed may have overlooked how fragile subsistence could be. For many, the rat was not a creature to defeat, but a force to negotiate with. Over time, as urban planning improved and grain storage became more secure, raised floors, sealed barrels, improved pest control, the custom faded. But traces lingered. Even in 19th century tenement buildings, records exist of tenants requesting to keep a certain floor corner for the crumbs, despite no apparent vermin present. Today, this practice is largely forgotten. We seal our food in airtight containers. We call exterminators. And yet the idea that survival sometimes requires diplomacy, even with the unwanted, still echoes faintly in how we approach uncertainty. We bargain with complexity. We offer up small sacrifices, hoping the greater whole will be spared. So if you ever visit a historical village and notice an oddly clean space in the corner of a storeroom, or a scattering of dry crumbs tucked beneath an unused stair, it may not be negligence. It may be memory of a time when people knew the rats would come, and tried in the quietest of ways to make peace. The painted marks on walls declaring legal protection. Imagine a narrow medieval street, its stones slick with rain, its doors shut tightly against the cold. The scent of wet wool and smoke hangs in the air. Somewhere, a church bell tolls distantly, marking time in a city where time is measured not only by hours, but by debts due, favors owed, and promises made. And on one particular doorway, almost faded now, is a chalk mark, simple, pale, and roughly drawn. It is not decorative. It is not religious. It is legal. And it means something very specific. Do not enter. This house, for now, is under protection. In medieval Europe, the legal system was often as visible as it was verbal. When enforcement relied more on community understanding than police presence, symbols became essential. And among the most quietly powerful of these symbols was the painted mark of sanctuary. Drawn in chalk, paint, or charcoal, often just above the doorway or along the wall beside it. These marks, in various forms, declared that the household or individual was under temporary legal protection. And for as long as the mark held, even the most persistent debt collector was expected to hesitate. The details of these protections varied by region. In some cities, especially those influenced by Roman or canon law, sanctuary might be claimed through a local church or guild. In others, civic custom allowed debtors certain protections within their own homes, particularly if illness, childbirth, or religious holidays were involved. The mark on the wall served as both announcement and shield, a visual cue that the law, however fragile, had been invoked. One common version of the mark was a simple circle, often drawn with a line through it, sometimes with initials indicating the type of protection granted. In parts of the Low Countries, it was called de teken van rust, the sign of rest. In some Italian towns, a variation was known as il cerchio di tregua, the true circle. Though simple in appearance, these symbols carried weight. To violate one was not merely a breach of custom, but a moral and often legal offense. And yet, the marks were temporary, vulnerable in every way. Rain could blur them, time could fade them, and a bold enforcer, if inclined, might choose to ignore them altogether. That uncertainty made the symbols both sacred and fragile. Families would check them each morning, sometimes retracing the lines in silence. Children were warned not to touch them. Visitors, especially those unfamiliar with the house's situation, were quietly guided through another entrance. There is a telling account in a 14th century ledger from the city of Rouen. A merchant's widow, recently bereaved, had a chalk mark placed on her door with the help of a local guild official. It granted her 3 days' grace from debt collection. Each morning, her son redrew it before sunrise, watching the damp stone swallow the line. On the 4th day, the debt man came, and finding no mark visible, knocked once and waited. When the door remained shut, he walked away. Not because he was convinced, but because in that moment, hesitation was still stronger than certainty. Not all marks were universally respected. Enforcement varied. In smaller towns, a well-liked family might enjoy weeks of unchallenged sanctuary. In larger cities, competing jurisdictions, church, city council, local lord, could create confusion. Some families, fearful of retribution, would surround the mark with religious imagery, crosses, saints' initials, or brief prayers. It was a way of blending law with piety, of cloaking legal claim in moral authority. For some, the act of marking the wall was ceremonial. It might involve a guild witness or a family elder. In times of particular desperation, it could be done silently, just before dawn, in the hope that no one would see and question the claim. The rain, so often a quiet companion to medieval life, was both friend and enemy in these moments. It softened the world, blurred lines, discouraged visitors, but it also erased marks. And when protection was as thin as chalk, every droplet mattered. In a few surviving texts, we find mention of households watching their marks through the window, hour by hour. A Flemish journal from 1462 describes a family sitting together through a storm, speaking little, as the white line on their wall slowly washed into nothing. There was no sudden consequence. No one came. But when the mark was gone, so too was their shield. They knew it. Interestingly, the practice has echoes in other cultures. In ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets marked with protective seals were placed above doors to ward off misfortune. In early Islamic cities, a painted sign could indicate a debtor's temporary reprieve. And in early modern Europe, long after the medieval period had ended, chalk marks on doors would reappear during outbreaks of plague. This time to warn of illness, not legal status, but with the same solemnity. A sign that something important was being declared, without words. What makes these medieval marks especially haunting is their quiet dignity. They weren't declarations of defiance. They were pleas for pause, not stay away forever. But not yet, not today. And they reflected the delicate balance of medieval life, where a single week could mean the difference between recovery and ruin. So now, imagine that doorway again, rain falling softly, a woman inside, watching the wall, a line of chalk just visible against the stone. It won't last forever, but tonight, it's still there. And sometimes, that's enough. Because in a world where protection could vanish with the next storm, the act of making a mark, however fragile, was an act of hope, of faith in a moment of mercy. And in that gesture, quiet and pale though it was, entire families placed their trust. The cold cellars where spoilage was fought inch by inch. Imagine a stone cellar just below the floorboards. Low-ceilinged. Cool. The air is thick with earth and salt, faintly sour with smoke and brine. Your feet descend on uneven steps, and the light thins quickly, swallowed by shadow. The walls sweat. Somewhere, water drips slowly from an iron hook. And in the dim quiet, a small figure moves with care. She is checking the turnips. Each one is lifted, felt, turned. She runs her fingers lightly over the skin, checking for softness, for that telltale dampness that means it has begun to fail. She shifts the position of the salted beans. She wipes a film of moisture from the lip of a barrel. And then, with a furrowed brow, she notes something faint. Not strong. Not yet. But unmistakable. A smell. Not the warm rot of summer, but a cold, creeping scent. The kind that coils in from one corner of the cellar. Almost polite at first, until it isn't. Spoilage. In the medieval world, a cellar was not just storage. It was survival, and keeping it usable week after week was a battle fought quietly, daily, and inch by inch. Food, once harvested, began its slow decay. That was nature. But for a family of peasants, every onion, every root, every salted strip of pork had to last through winter, or beyond. Preservation wasn't just technique. It was an ongoing act of attention, discipline, vigilance. Most cellars were built beneath cottages, carved into clay or limestone, reinforced with timber beams. They were dark, damp, and cool, an advantage in preserving food, but also a perfect place for mold to grow unnoticed. So families developed quiet rituals to slow its advance. Straw was the first defense. It was packed thick around crates, barrels, and walls. Dry, breathable, and easily replaced, it kept cold air circulating and moisture at bay. But straw itself could rot. It had to be changed, fluffed, replaced regularly. A job often given to the youngest children. Each morning, someone went down, not for food, but for checking. Barrels were rotated slowly to prevent liquid from settling. Brine was tasted. The thin skin of dried fat covering a pot of preserved beans was prodded. And always, the nose was consulted. A single bad onion could spread its spoil to the rest. One slimy fish could undo days of salting. And so, women and older children trained themselves to detect the first signs. A change in color, a strange texture, a smell like wet stone or old eggs. The battle was not loud. But it was constant. Some families kept ledgers, or more often, scratched symbols on cellar beams or doorposts. Simple marks, lines, circles, slashes, to record how long something had been stored. In larger households, wooden tags were tied to bundles of herbs, hanging game, or cheese wrapped in cloth. Dates weren't always written as numbers, but by feast days or moon phases. Salted on Candlemas, one might say. Or turned the second week after St. John's. The tension increased as winter deepened. In October, the shelves were full. Onions in braids, jars of pickled greens, fat-wrapped cheese, salted pork. There was comfort in the weight of it all. But by January, the cellar began to feel emptier, airier, and any hint of rot felt heavier, closer, like a small leak in a lifeboat. Chronicles from monastic farms record entire winter diets derailed by spoilage. A frost that cracked a wine barrel, a rat that gnawed through salted meat, a wet spring that crept up through the floorboards and ruined the potato stores. The monks wrote plainly, without drama, but their entries were edged with resignation. The cabbages at the west wall are no longer sound. That was all. But it's said enough. In peasant households, these events were not recorded, but they were remembered. A single ruined shelf could mean a week without stew. A winter without onions meant spring without health. Families passed these memories on like warnings. Always turn the root bag, someone might mutter. Or, don't trust the cheese in March. Even the position of items mattered. Foods likely to spoil first were placed at the front, easy to monitor. Dried herbs were hung higher, away from mice and rising damp. Pickled items were given corners, where they could cool more evenly. But if the wind shifted, or if the snow thawed early, the balance changed. Sometimes they caught it in time, sometimes not. There's an account from a manor estate in Lincolnshire of servants breaking open a barrel of salted fish in late February, only to find the brine clouded and the meat soft. The loss was noted not in outrage, but in calculation. How many meals it would affect? What could replace it? What wouldn't? Loss was part of life. But spoilage, unexpected loss, carried a deeper sting. And yet, the work continued. Every day, inch by inch. Not dramatic, not glamorous, just careful. Children were taught the rhythm. Straw on the floor, salt to the cracks. Turn the pot, smell the jar. Don't trust a dry top. Dig in a little. The oldest among them, the ones who remembered hungry years, would hum quietly while they worked. Not out of happiness, but out of habit. Something to fill the silence while they examined the cabbage heads for softness. And when spring came, when the first greens returned, when the cellar could finally exhale, there was no feast. Just a quiet loosening of the jaw. A bit less worry, but never fully gone. Because next year would come. The battle would return. Even today, in restored farmhouses or old European cottages, you might find a cellar like this. Low stone walls, marks along the beams, maybe a faint scent of mold that never quite left. Not because anyone failed, but because no one ever truly won. Preservation was never a victory. It was a daily decision, a cold, careful prayer, fought not with fire or fury, but with fingers, patience, and a nose that knew the difference between almost fine and already lost. And in that dim, quiet place beneath the hearth, survival waited in barrels, and rot always waited just beneath, inch by inch, day by day, until spring returned. The watchman's quiet footsteps that meant you were safe. Imagine a town at rest. The fires have burned low. The shutters are drawn. The hush of night has settled into every courtyard and chimney, softening even the hard outlines of stone. Somewhere in the distance, a dog shifts in its sleep. A church bell has long since marked midnight, and the city's life has slipped into silence. But beneath that silence, something moves. A footfall, then another. Soft, even, measured. The watchman is making his rounds. In many medieval towns, these night patrols became a kind of lullaby for the anxious. Their steady steps along cobbled streets, the quiet clink of a lantern's handle, and the distant call of the hour brought reassurance to those lying awake in the dark. It meant someone was out there, someone who kept vigil when others could not. But those footsteps were not always comforting, because if they stopped outside your door, something might be wrong. Across Europe, from London to Lubeck, towns and cities relied on night watchmen to maintain order after curfew. Their duties included deterring thieves, extinguishing open flames, and checking for signs of unrest, fire, or sickness. They carried lanterns or torches, staffs or swords, and often a horn or bell to summon aid. But more than that, they carried authority, and everyone heard them. The sound of their patrol, regular, subdued, unmistakable, filtered through thin walls and under door gaps. It became a rhythm that marked time through the night. A pattern that households came to know. A pattern they needed to remain unbroken. For if the steps paused, if the rhythm stuttered, if the soft crunch of boots on gravel gave way to silence, just outside your door, it might mean suspicion. Perhaps a report had been made. Perhaps a shadow was seen where none should be. Perhaps your door was simply too quiet, or too loud. Or perhaps the watchman simply stopped to scratch his beard or relight his lantern. But for those inside, in the hours when the mind wanders, it meant one thing. Someone was listening, and maybe deciding. There are accounts, scattered in letters and old diaries, of families lying awake, holding their breath as the watchman passed. Some describe the long seconds of waiting. Others recall the whispered prayers. He passed. One woman wrote in 1623, "And we exhaled like cattle in frost." Most patrols never stopped at all. They walked, turned, returned. Their presence was often enough. But on certain nights, especially during times of plague, rebellion, or unrest, their routes became more purposeful. Doors were tested, windows observed. A slight delay at your stoop could mean nothing, or everything. And if they knocked, it could mean a search, a question, a warning. In some cities, a knock meant your chimney was smoking too late. In others, it meant someone had accused you of harboring a fugitive, of breaking curfew, of whispering seditious words. Often, it was a misunderstanding. Sometimes, it was a beginning. So the night became a performance. Households learned to sound right after dark. Doors were barred, yes, but not too quickly. Lights were dimmed, but a glow was often left flickering to show the home still breathed. Movement stopped, but not with fear, only with order. Too still was as suspicious as too loud. Families developed a kind of choreography. How to be silent without being absent. And they listened to every step, because the watchman's footsteps were not just sound. They were signal, a nightly Morse code tapped into the bones of the town, and everyone heard it. Watchmen, for their part, were not always the grim enforcers we imagine. Many were hired from within the local guilds or communities. Some took pride in their regularity, becoming familiar figures whose routes could be timed almost to the minute. In small towns, a family might even know the exact rhythm of their neighborhood's watch. Old Willem's limp meant he reached our well at the third bell. One man wrote in 1497, and his sigh was louder than his feet. That familiarity bred comfort, but also tension, because watchmen, by nature, held power without needing to act. The mere possibility of their attention was enough to regulate behavior. It was a presence shaped as much by silence as by speech. And for the anxious or guilty, or simply the unlucky, that silence could be suffocating. One surviving folktale from Prague tells of a man who left his home each night to walk the alleys. When asked why, he said, It is better to be the footsteps than to fear them, but most people stay behind the door, still listening, because in a world without alarm bells, streetlights, or patrol cars, safety was not a guarantee. It was a hope, measured out in quiet intervals. It was the hush that followed each fading step, the absence of a knock, the echo that moved on. Eventually, the role of the watchman evolved. Cities grew, lanterns multiplied, curfews relaxed. Professional policing took shape. The personal sound of the night watch faded into the background. But the memory of it remained. Even today, in some old neighborhoods, people still recall the comfort of shoes on stone. Not rushed, not violent, just present. A signal that someone is awake, that someone is listening, that, for now, the danger is elsewhere. You can still find songs written in their honor, low, repetitive verses passed down in oral tradition. Some were sung by children in games. Others were whispered by mothers to lull their households to sleep. One by one the watchmen pass, slash boots on stone and breath, like brass slash if they knock. The dawn is far slash if they walk. You are where you are. And so people listened, not just with ears, but with hearts tuned to subtle rhythms. The ones that told you, without ever speaking, that you were still safe. That your name had not been whispered that day. That no one meant to stop at your door. And the footsteps passed, and you drifted to sleep. The shrines tucked into alley walls for protection. Imagine walking through a narrow alley in a medieval town. The buildings lean in above you, their beams weathered and close enough to almost touch. The stone beneath your feet is uneven, slick from yesterday's rain. But up ahead, just beyond a bend in the alley's curve, you see the faint flicker of a light, not from a window or a torch, but from a small recess in the wall. Set into the stone is a niche barely larger than a loaf of bread. Inside, a tiny figure of a saint, framed by soot-stained bricks and a single, trembling flame. These were the alley shrines, simple, weathered, deeply cherished. In many towns from the 13th century onward, especially in southern France, northern Italy, and parts of the Low Countries, these little shrines dotted the side streets, courtyards, and corners where foot traffic passed, but sunlight rarely lingered. Some were carved directly into masonry. Others were wooden boxes affixed to the wall with iron nails or brackets. Most featured a single image, often the Virgin Mary, Saint Sebastian, or the neighborhood's patron protector, accompanied by a votive candle, a clay oil lamp, or a hanging lantern. Their purpose was both spiritual and communal. They weren't meant to convert or preach. They were there to watch, to bless the passers-by, to shield the alley from misfortune, illness, theft, or violence, and perhaps most importantly, to remind the people who lived nearby that they were not alone. In cities where danger could arrive quietly, through plague, fire, or strangers' hands, people looked for protection not just in churches or courts, but in small, steady rituals. And the shrines offered that quiet certainty. They were passed daily without ceremony, yet nearly everyone made the small gesture. A bowed head, a murmured prayer, a coin dropped into the nearby jar. The care of these shrines was almost always communal. A particular household might have the shrine on its outer wall, but the responsibility belonged to the alley. Neighbors would take turns cleaning the niche, replacing wilted flowers, relighting candles blown out by wind or rain. Chroniclers described small gatherings in the early evening, residents pausing to check the flame, to refill the oil reservoir, to replace a cracked glass pane. In colder months, the flame burned through the night, casting a pale golden circle on the wall as frost settled on the cobbles. The cost of oil, especially in lean years, was shared in quiet, deliberate ways. A widow might offer a copper coin instead of bread that week. A child might be sent to fetch oil from a shop 2 streets over. A cloth merchant who had a good season might pay for a full month's flame, leaving the jar untouched but full. The contributions weren't recorded. No one was thanked publicly, but the flame continued. During outbreaks of illness, some alleys added protective charms. Bundles of herbs hung nearby, or chalk marks above the niche. Not official, not ecclesiastical, but accepted. In one Florentine diary from the 1490s, a baker's apprentice noted that the flame in their alley burned the whole month of fever, without once going out, though the wind struck hard each night. For him, this was not luck. It was evidence. The shrine had kept watch. In more prosperous areas, the shrines grew slightly more elaborate. Some were framed with wrought iron, or given painted shutters that could be closed in bad weather. A few gained small shelves for offerings, bread, coins, tiny cloth figures. But even the plainest ones carried meaning. A soot-darkened alcove with a cracked figure and half-melted candles still held power. Not because of how it looked, but because it remained. These shrines also marked boundaries, between public and private, between street and home. In many towns, alleys had no formal gate or guard, but they had a shrine, and that shrine, in the minds of those who lived there, offered a kind of spiritual threshold, a zone of protection. Thieves, it was said, would not strike where the Virgin watched. Fire would skip walls that bore the mark of the saints. Of course, not all dangers obeyed. Shrines did not halt war or weather, but they gave shape to hope. And in a time when much of life felt unpredictable, that was no small thing. Travelers sometimes remarked on them. Foreign visitors noting images in the walls with lights beside them, even in streets where no men stood guard. These weren't grand statues or formal icons, just small sanctuaries of flame, simple and overlooked, but unmistakable in their persistence. With time, as cities modernized and alleyways were widened or paved, many of the shrines disappeared. Some were removed deliberately, others simply crumbled, but a surprising number remain. Even now, tucked into corners of old neighborhoods, their images faded, their shelves dusty. Some still hold candles. Others have been quietly adopted by new generations who don't always know the names of the saints, but still light a flame. So tonight, imagine passing through one of those alleyways. The world around you is dark, the hour late, the stone cold. But in the wall ahead, a light glows softly. No grand altar, no ceremony, just a small, steady flame beside a figure who has seen centuries pass. And somewhere, down that same alley, a neighbor sleeps more soundly, because the light is still burning, because the shrine is still watching, because, even now, the smallest protection can still mean everything. The passing bells that warned sickness was close again. Imagine yourself walking down a cobbled street in a quiet medieval town. The air is still. Wooden shutters are drawn, though it is broad daylight. A dog trots silently along the gutter, nose low. A woman pulls her child indoors by the hand. You hear birdsong faintly, and then, cutting across everything, a slow, deliberate toll of a bell. Not the bright ringing of a church service. Not the hurried peal of alarm. Just a single tone, deep and resonant, spaced at long intervals. It echoes down the alleyways, brushing against stone and wood, until it fades, only to rise again. And as it tolls, people stop. Heads turn, hands still. Conversations pause, because the passing bell means that death has returned. And this time, it might be close. In many medieval towns and villages, the tolling of bells was a form of public communication as much as spiritual tradition. They marked the hours, called the faithful to Mass, and warned of fire or invasion. But among all these tones, one was uniquely solemn. The bell rung for the dead, especially those taken by sickness. The passing bell. Its sound was deliberate. One toll for a woman, two for a man, or three for a child in some traditions, followed by long, slow strokes that marked not the end of life, but the presence of death. It signaled that a soul had departed, or was about to, and in times of plague or widespread illness, it carried an additional, more fearful meaning. That disease had entered a household, that the barrier between your home and harm was now thinner than you'd thought. There were no sirens in those days, no printed health bulletins. When someone died of illness, it was the parish bell that told you first. In small communities, people often knew who was ill, but in larger towns, the bell became a signpost, pointing without naming, warning without words. And so people learned to listen. The tone of the bell, its direction, its frequency. If it rang once in a day, the town grew cautious. If it rang twice, people began to watch each other. If it rang 3 times, shopkeepers might close early. Doorways were washed with vinegar. Letters were delivered with gloves. Children were kept indoors. And conversations at the well dropped to whispers. Walls in medieval homes were thin, wattle and daub, wooden beams on mortared stone. They separated families, but they did not seal them off. Smoke passed through them. So did sound. And when disease was believed to spread through the air, or through breath, or through divine punishment, even silence felt unsafe. The idea of sickness as a creeping presence, one that moved through the streets and walls, shaped daily life. The passing bell was not simply a report of loss. It was a threshold. It meant that whatever had taken hold in one house might now be stirring toward the next. Some households responded with ritual. Doors were marked with chalk or pinned with herbs. Prayers were whispered at thresholds. Bread was left on windowsills for the poor, so they would not need to knock. In certain towns, a family might place a sprig of rue or rosemary above the lintel, not just for healing, but to signal to neighbors that they were well, or still were. The bell ringer themselves held a quiet, unsettling role, often a sexton or church warden. They became figures both feared and respected. They moved between the living and the dying, and they alone knew how many times the bell had tolled that week, and for whom. There are notes in surviving parish records where ringers quietly recorded deaths long before any burial service. In some cases, they knew before even the priest did. During times of plague, these bells became almost constant. In London during outbreaks, or in Italian cities struck by pestilence, chroniclers described the sound of bells tolling through the night, fading into one another like waves. People dreamed to the rhythm of death, waking only to find it had come closer. In response, silence became its own warning. If a parish fell suddenly quiet, no bells at all, it might mean the ringer was gone too. Not all towns rang bells openly. In more superstitious regions, communities feared that the sound itself might call death. In those places, the bell was muffled, wrapped in cloth, rung low and slow, or replaced with wooden clappers. The fear was not unfounded. Some believed that death could follow sound, that to acknowledge it aloud was to invite it in. And yet, people kept listening, not just for the number of tolls, but for their tone. A hesitant ring might suggest uncertainty. Was the household sick or simply fearful? A confident one might bring strange comfort, suggesting that the town still held its rituals, even as death approached. The passing bell didn't offer answers, but it did offer rhythm. And in a time when little could be controlled, rhythm was something. It gave people time to adjust their habits, to say a prayer, to avoid a street, to speak more softly. It reminded them that life was both fragile and shared. Over the centuries, as medicine improved and cities grew louder, the role of the passing bell diminished. Yet the sound still exists in some rural churches, preserved as tradition. And in moments of public mourning, bells still toll, slowly, with space between, enough to remind those who hear that someone has gone. But in the medieval world, that sound meant more. It meant, someone near you is dying. It meant, The sickness has crossed another threshold, and it meant your walls, however thick, are no longer enough. So the people listened, and hoped the next toll would not be for them. The careful accounting of every ounce of grain. Imagine yourself standing in the corner of a small urban home in a late medieval city. Bruges, perhaps, or Siena. The room is dim and quiet, except for the faint scratching of a stylus against wax. A low fire murmurs in the hearth, its heat barely touching the cold that seeps through the stone floor. And on the table before you sits a simple wooden box filled with grain. Not overflowing, not meager, but carefully leveled off. Beside it lies a set of carved weights and a balance scale. A ledger, not of paper, but of smoothed wood, leans nearby, its surface etched with rows of tidy lines and initials. This is not ceremonial. It is survival. In the crowded heart of medieval cities, space was limited, and so was food. Unlike rural villagers who might grow and store their own harvests, urban households depended heavily on markets, trade, and meticulous rationing. Grain, wheat, rye, barley, oats formed the basis of nearly every meal. And so, grain became not just a staple, but a currency of survival. Every ounce mattered. Many city dwellers, particularly in the merchant and artisan classes, developed elaborate systems to track their stores. Some kept ledgers carved into thin wood tablets, more durable than parchment, less expensive than bound volumes. A few even etched notations into plaster walls near their pantry doors. Each day's use was recorded. Each loss, however small, was noted. The act of accounting wasn't merely bureaucratic. It was protective. It was a way of staying ahead of hunger. In one surviving household log from Lübeck, dated around 1448, a baker's wife lists the grain weight each morning, comparing it to the previous day's tally. A decrease of even one handful prompts a margin note. Rat suspicion, moved box. Another entry, more ominous, notes, missing 3 handfuls, child questioned. There's no detail beyond that, but the tone is unmistakable. When your food is measured by the ounce, nothing disappears unnoticed. To modern minds, this may seem excessive, but in a world without refrigeration or mass storage, grain had to be watched closely. It spoiled with moisture. It attracted vermin, and it tempted theft, not always from outsiders, but sometimes from within. A hungry apprentice, a desperate servant, even a family member could skim from the jar in the hope that no one would weigh again too soon. Weighing the grain became part of the daily rhythm, like tending the hearth or locking the doors. And it wasn't always a solitary act. In some homes, the weighing was done by 2 people together, one measuring, the other recording, not out of formality, but out of quiet necessity. Shared tasks reduced temptation. They also created accountability in the most literal sense. In larger households, especially those of minor nobility or wealthy merchants, grain was often kept in a locked bin, with access restricted to a steward or matron. These bins, heavy wooden, reinforced with iron, were stored not in cellars, which could be damp, but in dry, elevated rooms just beneath the eaves. Even there, they were subject to inspection. In one inventory from Bruges, a steward notes that grain has settled and volume deceives. A reminder that weight, not fullness, was the true measure of provision. Interestingly, even monasteries were known for this kind of precision. Benedictine rules encouraged thrift and order, and monastic kitchens often kept grain scales mounted near the entrance. Records from a Swiss abbey show daily rations tracked not just by the pound, but by the libra minor, a measure equal to less than half a modern pound. The intention wasn't cruelty. It was sustainability. In a closed system, what disappeared could not easily be replaced. Some households added small touches to deter loss. Painted lines on the inside of a grain jar to show expected fullness. Weights carved with family marks to discourage substitution. In certain regions, Wax seals were placed on bins each night. Not to lock them, but to show if they'd been opened. If the seal was broken, even without grain missing, questions were asked. These practices weren't signs of mistrust. They were signs of vigilance. In the narrow lanes of cities where food prices could change with the weather or politics, grain security was as essential as clean water. One baker's journal from Paris, around 1370, contains the entry, "Bought extra barley. Bad clouds forming. Locked all bins. No drama. No panic. Just the quiet sense that something needed to be done, and done now." For many, the grain tally was the final act of the evening. Long after the tools had been cleaned and the doors barred, someone would weigh the store, then etch the numbers into wood, mark the wax tablet, or simply whisper the count aloud and commit it to memory. Even children were taught to respect the store, not to touch, not to peek, and certainly never to take without permission. So now, imagine yourself again in that quiet room. The fire burns low. The wind hums against the shutters. You hold a small, smooth weight in your palm and place it carefully on the scale. The grain settles. The balance dips. And you exhale, just slightly, because the number is as expected. Nothing lost. Nothing gained. Just enough. That was the rhythm they lived by. Not the ticking of clocks, but the weight of the day's rations. Not abundance, but enough. And in a world of uncertainty, where fortunes turned quickly and supplies could vanish with a bad harvest, that daily act of measuring was more than a chore. It was a ritual, a reassurance, a whisper of order in a world that offered little. And perhaps, in its own quiet way, it was also a prayer. The secret handshakes that gained you access to guild aid. Imagine yourself on a narrow cobbled street at first light. The town is still yawning awake. Shop shutters lift slowly. The smell of damp timber and yesterday's hearth smoke clings to the air. And somewhere a church bell marks the hour with a muted toll. You walk past rows of half-timbered houses until you reach an unassuming doorway framed by worn oak beams. Above it, a small wooden sign shows only a chisel and mallet, symbol enough for any craftsperson to know this is a guild hall. Inside, the room is plain. Long benches, trestle tables, a hearth banked low so the coals glow rather than flame. The guild master is already seated, quill in hand, ledger open. A few members trickle in, journeymen, apprentices, a widowed carpenter's wife trusted with her late husband's place. They greet one another in low voices, sleeves still dusted with sawdust or flecked with dye. Nothing feels secret here. Yet, beneath the ordinary talk, a quieter language moves, small gestures, practiced glances, touches that last just an extra heartbeat. These are the secret handshakes. They were never written down. No charter lists them, but for many medieval guilds, carpenters, weavers, masons, bakers, the gestures were a quiet promise. If misfortune came, if illness struck, if a bad winter left the larder empty, you could ask for help without begging. A single grip, exchanged in the right place, told the brotherhood, or sisterhood, that aid was needed. The simplest form began with an ordinary greeting, palm to palm. But as the hands met, one thumb pressed 3 quick pulses against the knuckle of the other's first finger. Hardly noticeable to an onlooker. To the guild member, unmistakable. It meant, I need bread. Another pattern, 2 long presses, 1 short, stood for work sought. A sliding of the little finger across the wrist asked for a small loan, often enough to buy raw materials or patch a leaking roof. Why the secrecy? Pride played its part. In towns where status hinged on visible prosperity, to admit hardship openly risked reputation, customers, and sometimes one's place in the guild. Yet the community understood that even the most skilled craftsperson could falter. A fire might ruin inventory. A cough could become consumption. An unlucky turn at market could leave a family hungry. The handshake allowed need to be voiced and answered, Without public loss of dignity, chronicles rarely mention these gestures outright, but hints appear in ledgers, notations of bread stipend discreetly given, or loan forgiven by vote of silence. A 14th century mason's account from York records a line of symbols, 3 small dots in a triangle, beside an entry for grain disbursement. Later generations assumed it was a price mark. In truth, it signified aid delivered after a silent request. The system worked because it was paired with ritual discretion. When the signal was given, the responding member might nod and move on, saying nothing. Later that evening, a covered basket would appear at the recipient's door, or a note would arrive instructing him to take up temporary work on the new chapel roof. Repayment, if required, came slowly and without interest. Sometimes it never came at all. What mattered was continuity. Keeping a craftsman at his bench, a weaver at her loom, a family in its home. The guild's strength lay in the steady rhythm of their lives. Not everyone understood or appreciated the practice. Town officials, eager for clearer records, occasionally demanded to know why coin left the treasury without names attached. Guild masters answered with a shrug. For the welfare of the craft, that was usually enough. Few pressed further. The quality of a guild's goods carried its own authority. For outsiders, the gestures were nearly invisible. A customer watching 2 bakers clasp hands over a deal would see only courtesy. Yet the baker's thumbs might be whispering of a sister's dowry shortfall or a child's medicine. In taverns, traveling journeymen tested unfamiliar halls by offering the greeting and waiting for recognition. A safeguard against imposters and thieves. Those who responded incorrectly exposed themselves at once. Those who answered properly became instant allies on a lonely road. There were limits. Aid was modest, bread, a loan of tools, introductions to employers, a place at the table during lean months. It could not shield against plague or war. When catastrophe struck on a grand scale, the handshake served instead as comfort. A shared grip in the face of forces far beyond any guild's purse. Still, within the narrow band of daily misfortune, the signals carried hope. Chronicles note that after a workshop fire in Bruges, every cooper in the quarter received work scooping salt barrels for the harbor within a week. Coordinated silently, handshake by handshake, so no family went hungry. Over time, some gestures faded as guilds formalized written charities. Yet traces lingered well into the early modern period. A London clothworker's minute from 1620 mentions customary finger tokens in passing, as if any reader would know them. And among Freemasons, echoes persist even today. Complex grips whose origins are whispered to reach back to medieval lodge rules. If you visit an old guild hall now, perhaps a museum, quiet with roped-off benches and polished tools, you might run your hand across the oak where countless grips once traded silent requests. The wood is smooth, almost glossy from centuries of contact. It does not tell its stories aloud. But imagine, for a moment, the press of a thumb, the answering pulse, the slight exhale of relief as 2 craftsmen part ways, their need understood. That pause, barely a breath, carried bread through winters, kept roofs overhead, bought medicine for coughing children, all without ledger lines loud enough for curious eyes. A kindness encoded into muscle memory and passed from master to apprentice like any other skill. And though the hands that practiced it have long since stilled, the idea endures, that help, offered quietly and accepted without shame, is a craft in itself. One as worthy of preservation as any carved beam or woven cloth. So when you step back into the sunlight and the morning crowd swells, remember the gentle code humming beneath the market's clamor. In every age, there are those small, wordless agreements, thumb against knuckle, pulse answering pulse, that keep hope alive when it is needed most. The rush to patch walls before winter's siege of cold. Imagine a village just as the leaves begin to fall. The air has turned, just slightly, brisk enough that the breath clouds a little in the morning, sharp enough to make fingers stiff before dawn. Overhead, geese call their last warnings to the season. And in the fields, everything has begun to contract. Pull inward, prepare. In the small cottages that line the lane, a different kind of harvest begins. Not of grain, not of fruit, but of warmth. Because before winter can be endured, the walls must be sealed. Throughout medieval Europe, especially in the countryside, the arrival of autumn brought with it a quiet but urgent labor. The patching of walls. Stone cottages, timbered huts, and daub and wattle homes all aged quickly under the strain of rain, heat, and time. By the end of summer, most had grown porous. Thin gaps in the corners, hairline cracks along the foundation. A dozen small breaches through which the coming cold would pour like a curse. And the cold was not merely unpleasant. It was a danger, an intruder. It could spoil food, damage tools, or creep into the joints of the elderly and the lungs of the very young. Once inside, it lingered. And so, each autumn, families turned to the task of sealing the home, wall, by hand, before the frost found its way in. There were no professional masons for this work. At least not here. This was a peasant's job, a family job, done with whatever was available. Clumps of straw, buckets of mud, bits of wool, old cloth, clay if you were lucky, ash if you weren't. Mixtures varied from region to region, but most followed a similar method. Mix wet earth with straw or chaff to create a thick, fibrous paste. Then, press it into the cracks between stones, or smear it across timber joints where the old daub had thinned. It was not elegant. It was not even particularly durable. But it was hope and necessity. Many did it without speaking, not because it was solemn, but because the work had been done so many times before. Words were no longer needed. The children knew what to carry. The mother knew which wall to check first, the one that had always wept cold near the cradle. The father, if present, stirred the mud with a branch and packed it deep with callous fingers. Sometimes, neighbors helped one another. More often, they did not. Because winter, in the villages, was survival alone. There are no grand chronicles of this labor. No poems to celebrate the sealing of a wall. But in the margins of tax records and personal letters, you find hints. One clerk in 1372 mentions a week lost to patching as the harvest drew late. A priest in Devon wrote of his flock preparing for the siege of the white breath, a phrase that meant nothing more than the breath that froze indoors before morning. The imagery is fitting, for winter was seen not as a season, but a siege. It pressed in, it waited for weakness, and any gap in the wall, any chink left unattended, became a point of entry, a wound. Patching was not limited to homes either. Barns were stuffed with rushes. Cellar doors were bolstered with wool-stuffed cloths. Pantry shelves were moved away from outer walls. In some places, animal dung was mixed with a daub for added insulation. An unpleasant task, but one that made the difference between preserved grain and rot. Families worked quickly and quietly, because time was always short, and because they knew, deep down, that no one else was coming. In the manor, the Lord might have stone walls and hearths big enough to roast an ox. In the church, there was shelter, but not always for the living. For peasants, there were no grand solutions, no coal shipments, no tiled stoves, only the walls they'd built themselves, and the patches they made each year with cold hands. In some households, a ritual formed around it. An elder might spit into the first handful of daub and press it to the wall with a whispered line. Part prayer, part defiance. In other regions, a family member would draw a mark in charcoal over a freshly patched joint, believing it would keep illness from seeping through. These gestures were not magic, but they made the work sacred and personal. There is something quietly human in this. The wall, after all, is not just a barrier. It is the skin of the home. It holds warmth, memory, breath. When you patch it, you are tending to something that, while not alive, shelters life. And when frost came, and it always came, you could feel where your work had succeeded or failed. Families would huddle around the hearth, measuring the cold not by temperature, but by silence. If no one could sleep near the east wall, it had let something in. If frost grew on the inside of the shutters, then the daub had thinned. But if the room held, if the chill paused at the threshold, then the patch had done its job, and you could rest. By spring, the work would crumble again. Rain would soften it. Mice would burrow through. Children would peel at it with fingers, and the cycle would begin anew. But that was spring's concern. For now, the wall was whole, and you had made it so. Even today, in some old rural homes, especially in places where preservation has been careful, you can still see the patch marks. Slight differences in texture. Lines where fresh daub was pressed against old. The faint echo of hands now long gone, shaping mud not for beauty, but for protection. No monument bears their names, but their work endures, in the warmth that once held through the night, in the food that stayed dry on the shelf, in the breath that didn't freeze. So picture that family now, kneeling in the fading light, smearing earth into the cracks of their world. No songs, no ceremony, just the quiet knowledge that if they didn't do this, no one would, and that tomorrow, when the cold came hunting, it would knock on a sealed wall and pass by. The herbs hung in windows to deter miasma. Imagine standing inside a narrow timber-framed home on a warm evening in midsummer. The window is cracked open just enough to allow a breeze, though it carries with it the unmistakable scent of the crowded street below, sweat smoke, the sour tang of standing water. But between you and that outside world, something hangs in the frame. A small bundle of herbs, tied with twine, slightly wilted and humming faintly with scent. The household trusts that bundle not only to perfume the air, but to protect the people within from something more sinister. Something invisible. In much of medieval and early modern Europe, the air itself was considered dangerous, not in the way we think of pollution today, but as a carrier of moral and physical corruption. This idea, the miasma theory, held that bad smells were not just unpleasant, but potentially deadly. Disease, it was believed, drifted through the air in foul vapors. Plague, fever, and rot traveled not by touch or water, but by invisible clouds of decay. And so, to defend their homes, people turned to the natural world. In countless windows, especially in poorer districts where illness struck hardest, you would find bunches of herbs suspended by string or wire. Sprigs of rue, rosemary, wormwood, or lavender, sometimes tied with red ribbon or bound in linen. These plants weren't chosen for decoration. Each had a specific reputation. Rue was called the herb of grace, thought to be especially powerful against contagion. Rosemary was associated with remembrance and purification. Wormwood, bitter and strong, was known to repel not only insects, but malevolent spirits. Together, they formed a quiet defensive wall, not physical, but aromatic. The bundles were often renewed weekly, especially in the warmer months when illness seemed to circulate more easily. In times of known plague, people grew more elaborate, adding garlic bulbs, mint, and even crushed juniper berries. Some soaked the bundles in vinegar or spirits before hanging them to intensify their effect. Others burned the herbs on small coals placed near the sill, letting the smoke create a protective haze. Chroniclers from the 14th and 15th centuries mention the practice often, not as superstition, but as common sense. In the time of pestilence, one Londoner wrote in 1361, "The windows of the poorer homes hung thick with herb, the air thus gentled, the breath made safe." There's no mention of science, of course, but the belief was practical and widespread. The practice wasn't limited to homes. You'd find similar bundles hanging over doorways to shops, inns, and churches. In hospitals, particularly leper houses and plague wards, herbs were packed into wall cracks or laid beneath floorboards. Some physicians even carried small herb sachets in their robes, occasionally raising them to their face when passing through crowded streets. In some towns, civic authorities ordered herbs to be distributed to the poor during outbreaks. It wasn't purely charitable. People feared that the illness would spread faster in unscented quarters. So they gave rue and rosemary the way we might hand out masks or soap. Quiet tools of hygiene, cloaked in ritual. For wealthier households, the herbs became part of household management. Housekeepers oversaw their placement. Children were sent to market stalls to gather fresh bundles. In gardens, people grew their own protective plants, not just for flavor or fragrance, but because to run out, to have no barrier hanging in the window, was considered careless, even dangerous, and the air, for its part, was always under watch. People sniffed it constantly. A shift in scent, a whiff of rot, a sourness in the wind, was enough to prompt a change in routine. Windows might be closed, or every window might be opened at once, depending on belief. The herbs were adjusted. New bundles hung. Old ones burned in the hearth. It was a system of sensory vigilance. Some households developed specific arrangements. One might always hang 3 bundles, rue in the center, rosemary to the left, wormwood to the right. Others marked the strings with charms, bits of colored cloth, or even carved tokens meant to intensify the protective effect. Not quite superstition, but not quite habit either. Something in between. Care expressed through repetition. Children were often told stories to explain the practice. That rosemary could see bad breath in the air. That wormwood bit the sickness before it bit you. The language was simple, but the message was clear. These plants were guardians. As long as they hung in the window, the household had done its part. Interestingly, while the miasma theory would eventually give way to germ theory in the 19th century, many of the plants chosen for these bundles do have antimicrobial properties. Modern science can't prove they purified the air to any significant degree, but their strong scents did mask unpleasant odors. And in a time when fear was often worse than the illness itself, even a faint illusion of safety could make a difference. Even after the height of the miasma theory passed, the custom lingered. In rural villages, herb bundles remained common well into the 18th century, not just during plague, but in ordinary seasons of illness. They hung alongside dried onions, prayer slips, and rosary beads. Quiet echoes of a time when the air itself was suspect. Today, if you wander the older quarters of European towns, especially in places where the streets have kept their medieval shape, you might still see the architectural niches and hooks above windows where such bundles once hung. They are empty now, but the practice, like the scent of dried herbs long faded, still lingers in memory. So tonight, picture that window once more. The alley beyond it dark, the air uncertain, but within the sill, a bundle of green and gray leaves hangs quietly. No sound, no movement, just the faintest perfume. Sharp, earthy, familiar. A signal to the unseen. A hope spoken not in words, but in rosemary and rue. And as the household sleeps, the herbs keep watch. Just as they always did. The cautious watch over shared bakehouse fires. Imagine the early light of morning spilling across the worn cobbles of a medieval village. Smoke rises gently from a low stone building at the square's edge, the communal bakehouse. Inside, the warmth of the great oven pulses steadily, the scent of flour and ash mingling with the faint tang of old wood smoke. You are not alone. Around the low hearth, a quiet assembly forms. Not a crowd exactly, just a slow gathering of figures. Women with baskets, boys sent by their mothers, older men pretending not to hover too closely. They stand in silence or soft conversation, eyes always drifting toward the arched mouth of the oven. Some carry marked loaves. Others clutch bundles of firewood, their hands dusted with flour. This was the shared ritual of the communal oven, the four banal in France, or furnace communis in Latin records. For centuries, many towns and villages relied on shared bakehouses, places where households brought their prepared dough to be baked in a common fire. Individual homes rarely had the means or permission to maintain an oven large enough for daily baking. Firewood was scarce, ovens were expensive, and in many places, lordly control over milling and baking made private bread-making illegal or heavily taxed. Instead, people gathered at the bakehouse. They waited their turn. They watched, and they worried. For although the bakehouse was a place of necessity, it was also a place of quiet suspicion. Each family's bread was precious, often made from flour scraped together over days, mixed with care, risen overnight beneath woolen cloth. When it was placed in the oven, it was briefly out of sight, and that made everyone uneasy. Chroniclers note this behavior with a kind of dry amusement. One 14th century English account describes villagers standing, not too near one another, yet close enough to see all, each nodding as if pleased, but with eyes sharp as needles. Another, from the Low Countries, recounts an incident in which two women claimed the same unusually large loaf, each insisting the other was confused or deceitful. To guard against such mix-ups, families developed small signals. Loaves were marked with cuts, notches, or press tokens, bits of pottery or shaped dough added before baking. Some etched initials into the crust with knives, or used a sprig of herb to identify their batch. But even with these precautions, watching was common, not openly accusatory, but steady, casual. A glance here, a cough there, a shifting of weight closer to the door. The fire itself was rarely the problem. It burned as it always did, banked and stoked by the village firekeeper or the lord's appointed baker. The concern lay with what came out of it. If a loaf was missing, or if a smaller one returned, few would confront directly. Accusations could stir feuds. So instead, the community developed its own forms of pressure. Silence, glances, and the long memory of who had baked beside whom. Sometimes, those who had no dough came anyway. They stood quietly, perhaps to accompany a child, or out of habit, or for warmth. But everyone knew that every presence had meaning. In the bakehouse, even small gestures held weight. A step too close to the baker's paddle. A question about someone else's turn. A hand held just a second too long near the resting shelf. Of course, theft did happen. In years of famine, or when grain prices spiked, desperation blurred boundaries. A loaf swapped here, a crust gone missing there. But these acts were rarely dramatic. The bakehouse was a place of subtle offenses and slow distrust. No one was tackled. No one shouted. Instead, the next morning, someone might simply not show up, or stand farther away, or speak to fewer people. In towns with formal guilds, communal ovens were regulated. An official might oversee weights, timing, and fair turn-taking. In smaller villages, the rules were informal but understood. Bread went in by rank or readiness. Those who arrived late waited. And everyone, whether noble widow or tenant farmer, watched with the same quiet care. The heat inside the oven could not be rushed. Loaves took time, and so the bakehouse became an odd kind of meeting place, where people gathered without fully trusting each other, where silence was more common than conversation, and where the fire's glow cast long shadows of cooperation and unease. Children, sensing the tension without understanding it, were often hushed. Apprentices or hired hands sent in place of their masters were watched more closely. Strangers or newcomers were rarely welcomed without scrutiny. Even the fire's rhythm seemed to reinforce the mood. Steady, slow, impossible to hurry, requiring patience and vigilance. And yet, for all the mistrust, the bakehouse was essential. It fed the village. It brought people together, if not in fellowship, then in mutual necessity. There are records of bakehouses being rebuilt first after fires, before homes, or even churches. Their stones were among the most worn in the village. Their smoke was among the most familiar. In time, as private ovens became more common, the role of communal bakehouses diminished. But in some parts of Europe, they lingered into the 18th and even 19th centuries, and in some places, they were never fully forgotten. Even today, in restored villages or historical reenactments, one might still see a group gathered near an old stone oven, watching quietly as the bread bakes, each person pretending to relax, but glancing always just slightly to the side. Because once, long ago, a loaf of bread was not only food, it was the measure of trust between neighbors, and the fire that baked it burned in the open, for all to see and all to watch. The lists of names whispered before locking the door. Imagine the final hour of a day in a medieval city. The streets have emptied. Market stalls have long been closed and covered. The scent of ash and boiled grain lingers in the air, and a cold draft slips through narrow alleys where earlier there had been shouting, footsteps, laughter. Now there is only hush inside the home. Shutters are drawn and lamps are dimmed. The household gathers near the hearth, tired from labor, quiet in their movements. And in many homes, though rarely spoken of beyond their own walls, a soft ritual begins. A head of household turns toward the door, and before bolting it, they murmur a list of names, one by one, each spoken low, not in prayer, but in confirmation. It was not universal, but in cities from Prague to London, Palermo to Ghent, records and oral histories suggest this practice was known, even expected. A parent or elder would recite the names of every person meant to be inside. Spouse, children, elders, servants, sometimes even regular boarders. Not loudly, not for show, but just loud enough for memory to respond. A brief pause between each name, listening not for a reply, but for a feeling that each name spoken matched a presence in the room. Because in the medieval city, absence was a constant fear. Disappearance was not always dramatic. People slipped away for many reasons: arrest, accident, illness, or simply mistake. A child distracted in the streets. A servant delayed by errand. A man detained by watchmen. There were no mobile phones, no citywide notices, and little trust in the chaos outside your own door. To miscount even once could mean not knowing until morning, and by then, the trail was already cold. So this small ritual evolved. Not formal, not decreed by church or law, but practiced all the same. A final check, not of locks and latches, but of lives. One name at a time. In a surviving account from 15th century Florence, a tailor writes briefly of his wife's habit. Each night, she whispers the names of our children before drawing the bolt. I do not ask her why. His tone is neither mocking nor reverent. It is simply matter of fact, the way one might describe any part of a routine. He doesn't say it brings comfort, but the fact that it continues suggests it does. Elsewhere, in household manuals and letters, we find indirect references. A mother instructing her daughter to never sleep until all are named. A steward noting that the girl was not spoken for before the door was shut. Even in guild records, there are cryptic notations about the missing name, possibly referring to someone unaccounted for during curfew. What's striking is the quietness of it. Unlike prayer, which might be addressed upward, or confession, which demands response, this ritual moved horizontally, across the room, across the memory. It required no feedback, just the trust that all were within hearing, or at least within walls. In households with infants or aging relatives, the naming might be done with glances, checking beds, nodding at corners, pausing slightly at names of those asleep. In larger homes, where not everyone gathered in one room. The names might be whispered while passing through the house, like collecting ghosts. And in those few cases where someone was missing, the final name would often go unspoken, held in the silence that followed. The act itself could be quick, just a few seconds, but it shaped the emotional atmosphere of the evening. It was both inventory and invocation, a way of affirming, we are still here. Some believed the ritual had protective qualities, that naming anchored the soul, made it less likely to stray or be taken. In certain folk traditions, particularly in the Slavic world, there were stories of spirits confused by names not spoken. And so, to name someone each night was to preserve their presence. Not just physically, but metaphysically. A thread tied between the body and the home. There's even evidence that during times of plague or unrest, the ritual became more deliberate. Longer pauses, even repeated naming. One account from Cologne in 1349 describes a merchant who, after locking the door, stood facing it for several minutes, repeating his sons' names aloud, though both were already within the house. He had seen too many fathers fail to do so. Too many who had assumed, too quickly, that all was well. Of course, the practice faded over time. As cities became more structured, streets more lit, and clocks more reliable, the need for such rituals diminished. But echoes of it remain. Parents still check on children before bed. Travelers still count companions before departure. And in moments of uncertainty, blackouts, storms, long nights, many still find themselves quietly asking, is everyone here? So now, imagine again that quiet room. The fire low, the walls holding in the last of the day's warmth. Someone stands by the door, hand on the latch, and in a voice barely louder than thought, they speak. Anna, Tomas, Lisbeth, father, son, wife, and then silence, just long enough to know that none are missing, and then the bolt slides into place. The names settle in the air like dust, and the house exhales. In a world where so much was fragile, naming became a form of keeping. Not magic, not certainty, just a small human tether. Between presence and memory, between door and darkness, between one day and the next.